Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized retelling inspired by real-life accounts surrounding Joan Collins and a chilling paranormal encounter she once alluded to in interviews. While certain details are drawn from publicly available reports and statements, others have been fictionalized or expanded for entertainment purposes. The events described herein blend fact with creative storytelling to enhance the suspense and atmosphere of the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, beyond the central figure of Joan Collins, is coincidental unless specifically noted. Los Angeles, California, 1978. The city was in full bloom, awash in neon lights, palm trees swaying against a warm night breeze, and the constant hum of dreams being chased down sunlit boulevards. For Joan Collins, it was both a professional playground and a battlefield. She was a British beauty who had conquered both the stage and screen, her career dancing between the elegance of period dramas and the bold glamour of modern cinema. That year, she had been shuffling between auditions, interviews, and public appearances, her face on magazine covers, her name whispered at high society parties. But behind the flawless makeup and dazzling smile, Joan was tired. The press rarely wrote about her quieter side, the one that craved solitude and space away from Hollywood's endless demands. She wanted a place where she could read scripts, enjoy a glass of wine without flashbulbs popping, and perhaps entertain a few close friends without the world watching. The mansion in the Hollywood Hills seemed perfect. It was a sprawling, three-story home set back from the main road, its driveway winding through a canopy of old trees that seemed to keep it hidden from prying eyes. The property had the kind of old-world charm Joan loved: marble floors, high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a grand staircase that looked straight out of a classic film set. The real estate agent had been careful not to linger on the house's history, brushing off Joan's casual question about the previous owners with a smile and a vague answer about old Hollywood families. From the outside, it was a dream home. But to the locals, it was something else entirely. Rumors circulated in hushed tones, stories of lights flickering in empty rooms, of a pale woman spotted in the upstairs windows long after the property had been vacated. Joan, pragmatic and ever skeptical of gossip, dismissed it all as nothing more than neighborhood superstition. Hollywood was full of ghost stories, after all. Her first visit to the mansion was almost magical. The golden glow of sunset poured through tall windows, casting warm light across the hardwood floors. The scent of aged wood and fresh paint mingled in the air. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but Joan chalked it up to being in a place untouched by the chaos of city life. She walked through the echoing hallways with a sense of satisfaction, already picturing where she'd place her antique chaise lounge and the ornate vanity mirror she'd brought from London. Still, there was something about the place she couldn't quite put her finger on. A subtle tension in the air, a faint feeling of being watched, not unpleasant, but undeniably present. She told herself it was just the novelty of moving somewhere new, that once she settled in, the mansion would feel like home. Maria, the housekeeper she'd hired through a friend, seemed less certain. The moment they stepped inside together, Maria's gaze flicked nervously toward the staircase. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but old houses remember things." Joan laughed it off, her British wit cutting through the unease, and instructed Maria to start unpacking. That night, Joan stood on the upstairs balcony, gazing out over the glittering city lights. The Hollywood Hills were peaceful, almost eerily so, with the distant sound of traffic muffled by the thick trees surrounding the property. She sipped her wine, allowing herself to believe she'd found her sanctuary. But deep down, a whisper of doubt lingered. In a city built on illusions, she wondered if perhaps the house had secrets of its own, ones that weren't meant to be uncovered. The first night in the mansion was meant to be a celebration. Joan Collins had arranged for a simple dinner, just herself, Maria, and a close friend, Beverly, who lived nearby. The three women sat in the dining room, the table lit by a crystal chandelier that cast delicate patterns across the walls. Outside, the night air was warm, the Hollywood skyline shimmering in the distance. It should have been perfect. But halfway through the meal, Joan noticed something odd. A sudden chill drifted through the dining room, brushing against her bare arms. She glanced toward the tall French windows closed tight. "Must be the air conditioning," she murmured, though she knew it wasn't running. Beverly shivered too, rubbing her arms, while Maria kept her eyes fixed on the chandelier above as though expecting it to swing. Later, after Beverly left, Joan took a slow walk through the house. The echo of her heels seemed louder than it should have been. In the grand hallway, she paused, certain she'd heard faint music. It was soft, almost delicate, like someone playing a piano in another room. She followed the sound into the parlor, but the grand piano in the corner sat closed, its surface coated with a thin layer of dust. The moment she stepped inside, the music stopped. When Joan mentioned it to Maria the next morning, the housekeeper gave her a wary look. "Old houses have memories," she said simply, her voice low, "and sometimes they play them back." Joan smiled politely, but said nothing. She'd been in plenty of old properties before. Drafts, creaky floors, and strange acoustics were nothing new. Still, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something about this place was different. That afternoon, while unpacking boxes in the bedroom, Joan noticed the curtains swaying gently, as though caught in a breeze. The windows were shut and locked. She crossed the room, running her hands along the heavy fabric. The moment she touched them, the swaying stopped. No breeze. No open window. She stood there for a moment, staring at her own reflection in the glass, feeling foolish for the shiver crawling up her spine. Her first truly unsettling moment came 2 nights later. Joan woke around 3 a.m., heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed her sleep. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock down the hall. Then she heard its soft, muffled crying, like a woman sobbing quietly somewhere in the house. At first, she thought it might be Maria, perhaps on the phone or watching television, but the sound had a distant, almost hollow quality. It seemed to come from inside the walls, or perhaps from upstairs. Joan slipped out of bed, wrapping a silk robe around her, and followed the sound. But the farther she walked, the more it faded, until there was only silence. She returned to her room, trying to convince herself it had been part of a dream. Maria, however, had her own explanation. When Joan mentioned the crying over breakfast, Maria looked up sharply from the table. "It's her," she said. Joan frowned. "Her who?" Maria hesitated, glancing toward the staircase as if the name itself might stir something awake. "The lady in white. I've heard of her from other maids. She walks the halls at night." Joan gave a little laugh, though it sounded weaker than she intended. "I'm sure it was just the wind," she said, though the words felt hollow. She prided herself on being level-headed, but she was beginning to sense that something about this house resisted rational explanation. The week went on, and more little things began to happen. Joan would set down her reading glasses in the library, only to find them later in the kitchen. The radio in the parlor would turn on by itself, playing a crackling old love song. Doors creaked open as she passed, sometimes slowly, almost deliberately, as though inviting her inside. By the end of that first week, Joan found herself moving through the house more cautiously. She kept lights on in hallways, avoided glancing too long into mirrors, and tried not to think about the crying in the night. But deep down, she knew these were only the first whispers of something much darker. By the second week in the mansion, the strange occurrences had grown bolder, no longer confined to subtle chills or faint sounds in the night. It began with the lights. At first, Joan thought it was a faulty electrical system. This was an old house, after all. But the pattern was too deliberate. The bulbs in the grand staircase chandelier would flicker only when she walked beneath them, as though reacting to her presence. She even had an electrician come to check the wiring. He found nothing wrong. Then there was the perfume. It wasn't hers. Joan favored a light floral scent, but this fragrance was richer, heavier, almost intoxicating. It would appear without warning, filling the air around her, lingering just long enough for her to notice before fading away completely. The first time it happened, she searched the house for its source, thinking perhaps Maria had sprayed something. Maria, however, swore she hadn't. One night, Joan was jolted awake by the sensation of cool air brushing across her face. She sat up to find her bedroom window wide open, the curtains billowing in the midnight breeze. That alone would not have unsettled her. Perhaps she had forgotten to latch it, but when she stepped closer, her heart froze. On the polished hardwood floor beneath the window were footprints. Small, barefoot, and wet, as though someone had stepped out of a bath. They led away from the window and disappeared into the hallway. Joan followed them, her breath shallow, but they ended abruptly halfway down the corridor. She searched every room, every corner, but found nothing. The house was silent again. She returned to her bed, locking the window tightly this time, yet sleep refused to come. She kept replaying the image of those footprints in her mind. The animals seemed to sense it too. Her cat, Cleo, who had always been fearless, now refused to enter certain rooms. She would freeze in the doorway, ears flattened, hissing at what appeared to be empty air. One afternoon, Joan found her perched on top of the refrigerator, eyes fixed on the dining room as though tracking invisible movement. The final straw for Maria came on a Sunday morning. She had been dusting the upstairs landing when she suddenly appeared in the kitchen, pale and trembling. "Senora," she whispered, "I heard her behind me. Breathing." Maria explained that as she worked, she'd felt a chill at her back, followed by the distinct sensation of someone standing inches away. When she turned, the hallway was empty, but the chandelier above her began to sway as though someone had brushed past. Maria's fear forced Joan to seek answers. That afternoon, she invited a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Larkin, over for tea. Mrs. Larkin had lived in the area for decades and knew the mansion's history. She did not hesitate when Joan asked about the previous owners. "The last woman to live here was Evelyn Harper," Mrs. Larkin said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She was a silent film star in the 1920s. Beautiful, glamorous, but her life was filled with scandal. One night, she had a terrible fight with her husband. The neighbors heard shouting and then a scream. According to Mrs. Larkin, Evelyn had fallen, some say been pushed, down the grand staircase, breaking her neck instantly. Her husband disappeared soon after, and the house passed through multiple owners, none staying long. "Some people say Evelyn never left," Mrs. Larkin added, her eyes fixed on Joan's. "They see her in the windows, smelling of her favorite perfume." That night, Joan dreamed vividly. She saw a woman in a white silk gown, her face hidden beneath a delicate veil, standing at the top of the staircase. The woman raised a pale hand toward Joan, and before Joan could move, she felt herself tumbling backward into darkness. She woke drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the faint scent of heavy perfume clinging to her sheets. What had begun as curious oddities had now become undeniable patterns. The mansion was no longer just a backdrop for her life, it was an active, watchful presence. And it was growing bolder. It was a Tuesday morning when the haunting took its most personal turn. Joan had an important audition later that afternoon, and she wanted to prepare in peace. The sun was streaming through the tall windows of her bedroom, casting warm light across the vanity table where she sat brushing her hair. The mirror in front of her was an antique and ornate, gold-framed piece she had brought from London, one she had used for years without a second thought. That morning, as she smoothed her hair and leaned forward to check her makeup, she froze. Behind her reflection, in the mirror's silvered glass, stood a figure. It was a woman, tall and slender, dressed in a long, flowing gown of ivory silk. A delicate lace veil obscured her face, but Joan could still make out the pale outline of her cheeks, the soft curve of her jaw. The figure stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of her, radiating a strange combination of elegance and sorrow. Joan's breath caught in her throat. She spun around so fast that the chair scraped loudly against the floor. The room behind her was empty. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, replaced by nothing but her own pale, wide-eyed reflection. Joan sat there for a long moment, gripping the edge of the vanity, willing herself to believe it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps the lingering effect of her restless sleep. But deep down, she knew she had seen someone standing behind her. As if to confirm her fear, that scent returned. The perfume. Heavy, sweet, unmistakable. It wrapped around her like a ghostly embrace, strong enough that her eyes watered. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint rustle of the curtains at the far end of the room. Shaken, Joan decided to distract herself by exploring the attic, thinking perhaps she'd find something to occupy her mind. The attic door was tucked away at the end of the upstairs hall, hidden behind a panel that blended almost seamlessly into the wall. She had never been up there before. Maria refused to even touch the latch. With some effort, Joan climbed the narrow, creaking steps, emerging into a dim, dusty space that smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper. Stacks of boxes and covered furniture crowded the room, but one item stood out, a large leather-bound photo album resting on top of a trunk. Curiosity overcame her unease. She opened it carefully, brushing away decades of dust. The pages were filled with sepia-toned photographs, black and white portraits of elegant parties, film sets, and candid moments in a bygone era of Hollywood. And then she saw her. It was the same woman from the mirror. The ivory gown, the delicate veil, though in the photograph, the veil had been lifted, revealing a striking face framed by dark, wavy hair. The name scrawled in neat handwriting beneath the picture read, Evelyn Harper, 1923. Joan's fingers trembled as she traced the name. She thought of Mrs. Larkin's story, of Evelyn's tragic fall and the unanswered questions surrounding her death. She could almost feel the weight of Evelyn's eyes through the photograph, as though she were watching Joan even now. A sudden noise jolted her, the sound of something heavy sliding across the attic floor. She whipped her head toward the far corner, but there was nothing there. Still, the air felt charged, as though the room had become aware of her intrusion. Without taking the time to close the album, Joan placed it back on the trunk and hurried down the attic stairs, her heart hammering. That night, she avoided the vanity entirely. She couldn't bear the thought of looking into the mirror and seeing Evelyn again. But even as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image, the delicate veil, the elegant gown, the silent, unmoving figure standing just behind her. It wasn't just an apparition anymore. Evelyn had a face, a name, and a story. And for reasons Joan couldn't yet understand, that ghost had chosen her. The day had been unusually hot for the Hollywood Hills, the kind of oppressive heat that made the air feel heavy and restless. By evening, clouds began to gather, dark and swollen, rolling in from the west. Joan noticed the change in atmosphere almost immediately. The breeze that drifted through the open windows carried with it a strange electricity, and the house seemed to grow quieter, as if bracing for something. Maria had already gone home for the night, and Joan decided to settle in with a script she needed to review. She curled up on the sofa in the library, a glass of wine at her side, and the storm began in earnest, first with low rumbles of thunder, then with jagged streaks of lightning that illuminated the rooms in stark, ghostly flashes. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The sudden darkness was total, broken only by the brief flicker of lightning through the tall windows. Joan sat very still, waiting for her eyes to adjust. Then she heard it. The sharp, deliberate click of high heels on wooden floors upstairs. The sound was unmistakable, measured and unhurried, echoing down through the empty halls. Joan's breath caught. She set her wine glass down carefully, straining to hear. The steps grew louder, moving toward the grand staircase. "Maria," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs. Then, slowly, they began descending click, 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 each one perfectly timed, each one sending a shiver down her spine. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief burst of light, Joan saw a figure standing halfway down the staircase. It was Evelyn. The gown was unmistakable, now streaked with what looked like dried blood along the hem. Her head was slightly tilted, the delicate veil obscuring her features, but Joan could feel the weight of her gaze even through the shadows. The figure raised one pale arm and pointed not at Joan, but toward the bottom of the staircase. Joan's eyes followed the gesture, but there was nothing there. When she looked back up, Evelyn had vanished. The silence lasted only a moment before the entire house seemed to come alive. A violent gust of wind tore through the rooms, slamming doors and toppling books from their shelves. Curtains whipped violently, though the windows remained shut. The chandelier above the dining room began to sway wildly, the crystals clinking together like frantic whispers. Joan's heart pounded as she backed toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. Behind her, a deafening crash echoed. Something heavy had fallen in the library. Then came the smell. The perfume. Stronger than ever before, almost choking, as if Evelyn herself stood right beside her. In a moment of sheer panic, Joan abandoned the lock and ran barefoot through the house, her only thought to get outside. Lightning lit her path as she sprinted toward the side door leading to the garden. Just as she reached it, another sound froze her in place, a woman's scream, sharp and piercing, reverberating through the halls. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of rage. Joan wrenched the door open and plunged into the rain. The downpour was relentless, soaking her instantly, but she didn't stop. She tore down the driveway, the storm swallowing the sound of her ragged breathing, until she reached her car parked at the gate. She flung herself inside, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor her. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment, she saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. Behind her, in the faint glow from the storm, sat Evelyn, her veil gone, her pale, cold eyes fixed directly on Joan's. Joan screamed, twisting around, but the back seat was empty. Her hands shook so badly she could barely start the engine. Tires splashed through puddles as she sped away from the mansion, not daring to look back. The perfume still lingered faintly in the car, a final reminder that what she had seen was no dream. That night marked the end of her time in the house. She knew, without a shred of doubt, that she would never return. Joan sat in her car for nearly an hour after she fled the mansion, parked in a dimly lit gas station several miles away. Her clothes clung to her, soaked through from the storm, her hair plastered to her face. She kept the engine running, the heater blasting in an effort to stop her violent shivering. Every creak of the car, every distant rumble of thunder, made her flinch. When dawn finally broke, the rain had slowed to a mist. Joan's eyes were red and swollen, not from crying, but from the sheer strain of staying alert through the night. She hadn't dared to close them once, afraid she might open them to find Evelyn's face staring back at her. The moment the clock struck 7 a.m., she picked up her phone and called her assistant, Charles. Her voice was low but urgent. "Go to the house. Pack everything. I want it all out before noon." There was a pause on the other end, and then Charles asked, "Is everything all right?" Joan's reply was sharp, almost desperate, "No questions. Just do it." Within an hour, Charles arrived at the mansion, only to find Maria standing on the front steps, her arms crossed, a small suitcase at her feet. She refused to go back inside. "I will not step foot in that house again," she said firmly when Joan later questioned her. "Whatever is in there, it's not human. And it's not at rest." Charles and two movers took care of the packing. Even they felt uneasy more than once. Joan overheard them muttering about hearing footsteps in the empty rooms. By midday, everything she owned had been removed. Joan stood in the driveway, refusing to look back at the house. She signed the final papers with the real estate agent that same afternoon. When Joan asked the agent directly about the mansion's history, his smile faltered for just a second. "It's an old property," he said vaguely. "Beautiful, yes, but it's had a hard time keeping tenants." She pressed him, and finally, he admitted, no one has lasted more than 6 months there. "Some leave after a week. You wouldn't be the first to break your lease." Joan left the meeting with a sick, twisting feeling in her stomach. Whatever she had experienced, she realized she was part of a much longer pattern, one that likely began the night Evelyn Harper died. She booked herself into a luxury hotel in Beverly Hills that same evening. The moment she walked into the bright, bustling lobby, with its polished marble floors and fresh flowers, she felt an almost physical weight lift from her shoulders. But safety was relative. For the next few nights, Joan kept every light in her suite on, the television playing quietly to fill the silence. Friends noticed the change in her. She was still glamorous, still impeccably dressed, but there was a new caution in her eyes. When asked why she had left the mansion so abruptly, she would smile faintly and deflect with a simple, "It just wasn't the right fit." Only with her closest friends did she share the truth, though even then, she kept some details to herself, afraid they might think she was losing her mind. For weeks afterward, Joan found herself glancing over her shoulder in public places. In the middle of a film shoot, she once caught a whiff of that perfume, rich, heady, and wrong, and felt her skin crawl. She told herself it was someone else's fragrance, nothing more, but her hands trembled for the rest of the day. In private moments, she would recall the storm, the scream, the cold eyes in her rearview mirror. She tried to tell herself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, she knew better. Evelyn Harper had not just been a story whispered by neighbors. She was still there, bound to that house, waiting. And if Joan had stayed one more night, she wasn't sure she would have left at all. The first night in the mansion began with an unsettling stillness that was almost suffocating. After a long day of filming and socializing with the other guests, Joan retired to her lavishly decorated bedroom, a grand space with antique furniture, heavy velvet drapes, and a massive four-poster bed. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and something else she couldn't quite place, an odor faint but distinct, like damp earth mixed with decaying flowers. The moment she entered, she felt the atmosphere change, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the exhaustion of the day, but as she unpacked her things and prepared for bed, she kept catching glimpses of movement in the corner of her vision. The dressing mirror seemed to hold a faint shadow that didn't belong to her, shifting ever so slightly when she looked away. Joan sat on the edge of the bed, telling herself it was nothing more than tricks of the light. At exactly midnight, she awoke suddenly, unsure of why she had been stirred from sleep. The room was darker than before, almost unnaturally so, and the silence had turned oppressive. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, but the second hand wasn't moving. The ticking had stopped. Slowly, a faint, rhythmic sound began to rise in the distance. It was the unmistakable creak of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and approaching from the long hallway outside her door. Joan's heart pounded as she strained to listen. The footsteps paused directly outside her room. Then came the sound of the brass doorknob twisting ever so slightly. She froze, gripping her sheets tightly. The door, however, didn't open. Instead, a whispering voice seeped through the wood, low, raspy, and impossible to understand. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a ghastly harmony. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, her breath visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Joan's relief was short-lived. From the far corner of the room, a soft scraping noise began, as if something was being dragged slowly across the floor. She turned toward the sound, and her blood ran cold. The tall mirror opposite her bed was fogged over, and in the condensation, a handprint began to appear, long, bony fingers pressing against the glass from the inside. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her body felt pinned to the bed, as if the very air was pressing her down. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed through the room. The mirror shattered, glass cascading onto the floor in a sharp, glittering rain. From the darkness where the mirror had been, a faint figure emerged, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. Joan's paralysis broke. She bolted from the bed and ran toward the door. But before she could reach it, the lights flickered violently, and the figure let out a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate in her chest. She yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. The corridors stretched endlessly, the dim wall lamps casting warped shadows along the peeling wallpaper. Behind her, she heard the distinct sound of glass crunching underfoot and knew the entity was following. Heart racing, she ran down the hallway without looking back, the oppressive feeling of being hunted growing with every step. She didn't stop until she reached the main staircase, where the distant sound of laughter, eerily out of place, echoed through the vast, empty mansion. That night, Joan did not return to her room. She found a chair in the corner of the grand foyer and sat there until the first rays of dawn lit the windows. Though she was exhausted, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been watching her the entire time, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And in her gut, she knew the first night had only been a warning. The days following Joan Collins' terrifying experience at the countryside estate were filled with an unsettling mix of disbelief, unease, and relief. She had escaped the house physically unharmed, yet her mind carried the weight of what she had witnessed. The public explanation was simple: exhaustion, an overactive imagination, perhaps a trick of the old home's creaky foundations. But Joan knew, deep down, that what she encountered was no figment of her mind. She returned to her London home, grateful for the familiarity of the modern world, bright lights, bustling streets, and the constant hum of life. Yet even there, the shadows seemed darker than usual. Certain corners of her flat made her uneasy, as if something unseen lingered just out of sight. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, especially when she found herself alone at night. In the weeks that followed, Joan avoided speaking publicly about the incident. Friends who visited her after the event noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She was more cautious, more hesitant to accept invitations to isolated locations, especially old estates. Those who knew her well said she had developed an instinctive habit of keeping lights on in every room she entered. The estate owners, eager to downplay the scandal, quietly sold the property to a private buyer. Rumors swirled about its history, stories of tragic deaths, mysterious disappearances, and a family curse. None of these tales had been substantiated, but in the realm of the supernatural, truth and rumor often blended seamlessly. Privately, Joan made one final visit to a close confidant, an elderly medium who had been a trusted friend of her late mother. The medium listened intently to Joan's account, her eyes narrowing with understanding rather than skepticism. She explained that some spirits are not tied to a single location. They can attach themselves to a person who has witnessed them, drawn by the fear they evoke. This revelation chilled Joan to the core. Whatever you saw, the medium warned softly, it knows you saw it. And sometimes, that's all it needs to follow you. Although the medium performed a cleansing ritual in Joan's home, the actress admitted she still felt an occasional, inexplicable presence, like a faint whisper brushing against her ear or a shadow slipping away when she turned her head. These occurrences were infrequent, but enough to remind her that her encounter at the estate was not entirely behind her. Over time, Joan resumed her work, returning to film sets and interviews, but she remained guarded when speaking of anything paranormal. She became a quiet believer, someone who had looked into the veil between the living and the dead and found something looking back. For the rest of her life, she avoided that part of the countryside altogether. And though the public never knew the full truth, those who heard her story behind closed doors were left with the same unease, the knowledge that some places, and some encounters, leave a mark that no amount of time or distance can erase. Even years later, Joan sometimes woke from her sleep in a cold sweat, her heart racing, with the memory of that one night playing vividly in her mind, the flickering lights, the echoing footsteps, and the hollow, watchful eyes staring at her from the dark. The fear never entirely left her. One